Good evening, everyone. April 8th, 2022. Time for episode 45 of The Last Admiral. And we take up where we left off with Lord Gygax aboard Terribilis facing off against Blackbeard and his ship. Okay. The rest of the book is probably my favorite, where I took a lot of artistic license, if you will. I tried to push the limits a little bit. Let's give it a shot. The title of the chapter is Archmagus. Lord Guy held his right arm up toward heaven, with his staff of wizardry in his hand. Pointing his left arm toward the sea, he drew power from the ether, the elements, and Tempest itself. His weapon was a composite of three perfect lengths of ironwood that had been meticulously steamed and twisted together to form a single strong wand of 6 feet in length. Its 3 ribs rose away from the hole at the top, and they were woven together like the frame of a crown, surrounding a single, flawless, multifaceted diamond 1 inch in height and in width. The ribs formed together at its base, each one seamlessly incorporated into its sisters and descending into a single blunt point shod in mithril. Summoning the staff's power, he conserved his own. His left hand was the guide, allowing the intentions of his mind to manifest themselves. Precise incantations released specific spells stored within it. He could use the staff's minor powers at will without depleting it, but its mightiest magic would. Holding nothing back, he lashed out at the enemies around them. His mind and his body were in tune with the energies of the world, forces in and around all things and known by countless names throughout all cultures. The unnatural use of such power came with a price. Invoking magic required real energy. Drawing power like water from a well, such use required careful consideration. Acts of goodness rewarded the sorcerer, while acts of evil could one day consume him. And mithril refers to the mythological mithril gold of J.R.R. Tolkien's works, a highly coveted, resilient, rare, and valuable metal. Okay. The dire necessities of war lay somewhere in between, but here their enemies would offer them neither mercy nor terms of surrender. Total annihilation was their clear and intended goal. The Firmin held nothing in reserve, nor would the most powerful magus who had ever lived. And of course, Gary Gygax, the founder of Dungeons and Dragons, is the most powerful magus who ever lived in my world. Okay. His left hand clenched tightly and hammered down in the direction of his intended target. Incendium globus, he incanted, and a tremendous burst of flame and incendiary heat ignited the mast and consumed the main sails of the approaching ship. Sailors on deck leaped to avoid curtains of falling flame, and iron fastenings burst free of their ropes. Libero fulmen, he evoked, and crackling energy formed out of thin air above the ship and lanced down, striking the mizzenmast and shattering its base to splinters. Still partially held in place by its rigging, it sagged to one side. Unbalanced, the ship listed slightly, but the rigging held, and the mizzen did not fall free. Sensing great danger in the bold approach of her captain, Lord Guy ignited their foremast and sails before turning his attention toward a second warship rapidly advancing on the port bow. Arrows rained down toward Terribilis like leaves driven by a gale, striking his invisible defensive barriers, most of them instantly deflected into the sea around them. His spells operated at the height of mortal power, and some sages admitted that they rivaled those of the gods' own. Nevertheless, the ship was huge, and because of this, it forced him to overlap multiple spells in an attempt to protect them from all sides. Sensing that one shield had fallen, he would replace it anew, but each casting took time. Even mere seconds without his protection allowed deadly missiles to pass through onto the decks, wounding and killing some Marines. Lord Guy accepted each weakness as his failure, but he was not a frail-willed man, and every mistake only emboldened him to fight harder. Another large square-rigged frigate was fast approaching them on the port bow, launching rockets at them. It was clear from their course that they meant to close in and board them. Several oil lamps swung from different parts of the enemy ship, looking for some weakness. He found a single small flame that was enough to manifest his power. A lamp, dangling from the foremast, suddenly burst, its glass shutters rupturing. A small burning globe, like a miniature sun, rolled free of it and onto the forecastle. Sailors leaped back from it, for it seemed as if the fire itself was a living thing. Growing rapidly, the ball of flame rose up. Its raging flame ignited the wood around itself. Its tendrils of heat seemed like arms, and its body best resembled a raging beast. Moving about, unnaturally both with and against the wind, it set fire to everything that it touched. Lord Guy controlled the raging spirit of fire with his will and attacked the weakest parts of the ship. Now, if you know anything about Dungeons and Dragons, you'll see that the magic use of my characters very closely parallels the rules of Dungeons and Dragons. As much as I could do to try to bring it to life, to make it real, it's very much a Dungeons and Dragons style of magic in my world. And this is the guy I talked about last time, Joe Garside. And Joe told me a story once that at a Dungeons and Dragons convention, he got to play D&D with Gary Gygax himself, the founder of D&D. And he said it was one of the greatest games it was the greatest game he ever played in his life. So, Gary Gygax, the founder of D&D, is Lord Guy in my book, Lord Guy the Mage. Okay, it's a little side story. All right. Unfortunately, I myself never had the privilege of playing D&D with Gary Gygax. Okay. But I suppose every time anyone plays D&D, in a way they do play it with Gary Gygax. Okay. So the spirit of fire is attacking the ship. Teach, or Thatch, if you prefer, Blackbeard, rallied his crew against it, and bucket brigades were formed, hurling water at the supernatural inferno. They drove it back and fought the growing fires. The enraged spirit held no dominion over water, and the two opposing powers grappled in great clouds of steam. Lord Guy urged the spirit to fight on, but its will could not prevail against the water. Its power diminished, it disappeared as quickly as it had risen. Both enemy ships were closing, driven as they were by a full complement of rowers. Terribilis had successfully turned a lee, and was beginning her run through the channel and toward the open sea. Marines on board, not otherwise engaged, worked hard to rescue swimmers driven overboard from their ruined vessels, and both friend and foe were hauled aboard equally. Most of the Furmen were grateful to have escaped the burning sea, but some, fearing capture and the horrors of unknown tortures, tried to seize some weapon and retaliate, and these had to be subdued. Their enemies approached, one abaft the starboard beam and the other abaft the port quarter. Thunderous reports erupted from the lower decks of the starboard ship. Projectiles of enormous power and devastation affected the field of power that protected the ship, and their force was the equal of it. His spell was ruined. Their next volley would rake the sails and destroy the hull. Preparing his protective spell anew, he sensed the power of another. And the footnotes. A lee is the situation of the helm when it is put in the opposite direction from that in which the wind blows. From Herman Melville, page 659, Moby Dick. Abaft means behind. Port quarter is the left-hand stern side of the ship when facing forward, and the starboard beam is the central right-hand side of a vessel when facing forward on deck from 4 points aft to 4 points forward of the center of the boat. So, in case you didn't know the nautical terms. Now you do. Okay. Warrior Magus. J.W. Acklon directed. You have the conning. I will defend the ship. Aye, sir, J.W. said. Red, adjust your course. 2 degrees to starboard. 2 degrees to starboard, sir, he replied. J.W., Acklon said sternly. Aye, sir, he asked. Whatever happens, if you have the opportunity, save yourself. I command you, do not go down with the ship. No, sir, I am with you, sir. As you were, then, he replied, ascending the stairs to the aft end of the poop deck. He braced his thighs against the gunwale, extended his hands toward the sea, and raised his power. Daiwi, keep the area clear, let no sailor approach. Do not look upon me, or my magic will consume you. Yes, Admiral, Daiwi promised from the feet of the stairs on the main deck. Tracing an imaginary radius around himself with his hands, Acklon conjured a rainbow-colored sphere of magic around his body. Crackling, transparent energy pulsed around him in a hemisphere that was twice the height of a man. Its power would protect him against many forms of attack for as long as it remained. The starboard ship's crew raced to reload their exotic weaponry. Conning is to direct the course of a ship. He knew cannons, and they were a prize much sought after by the Queen and every admiral in the fleet. Blueprints and the methods of their fabrication and use had been the ultimate target of infiltrating spies. Dragonian vessels possessed very few captured cannons, and never before had he faced an opponent with even one such device. Now the Queen's Navy was finally forging and developing their own guns based on the Eastern designs. But production had only just begun, and they were still far behind their neighboring enemies in that regard. Here, beside him now, was a ship with many of them, and they were actively reloading in preparation to fire another volley. Memorized spell formula filled his mind. They were latent triggers to powers at his command. Each spell required time and strategy. Any mistake could spell their doom. He had to stop the gunship. Clearly the armed frigate was fast enough to catch them even with oars alone, as they navigated inside of the main channel. Raising his hands, he embraced his warrior within. The ship was dangerously close. Sailors on both sides were now within easy reach for skillful archers. Many small pockets strategically filled with tiny objects lined his admiral's coat, substances and other items that were required for wizardry. He painstakingly stocked them all and was intimately familiar with the contents and uses of each one. A little pinch of the hardest material on Tempest, a complex wave of his left hand, and the words of his mind's intent, and he rent the hull of the approaching ship. Below the waterline, a section of planking and framing timbers the size of an elephant simply disappeared, as if they had never been. Water rushed in through the opening, releasing barrels and other flotsam into the sea. Seconds later, he drew a small wedge of steel from another pocket and whispered words of power that created a huge steel wall 50 feet in the air amidships. Over 5 inches thick and 300 square feet in size, it weighed many tons, and after falling with gravity onto the ship, the effects of its mass was greater still. Planking burst asunder beneath its crushing blow, and the ship shuddered violently before the plate finally came to rest against the burning mainmast. Gunners below decks fell off their feet, just as their many cannons were again ready to fire. Misfires resulted, and several stout-sounding reports like thunderclaps echoed inside of the ship. Terribilis began to outdistance them, but the warrior Magus had only just begun. Power coursed through his body and filled his mind. Magic and his people were as one living thing, inseparable and intimately interconnected. His next spell would take longer, but he felt that it was worth the effort. Countless missiles assailed the energy field around him. Repulsed or consumed by its magic, he sensed the probing attacks of another. The firman of Etzel had a Magus. And flotsam is wreckage or debris found floating in the sea. And Magus is a Zoroastrian priest, any of the three wise men who paid homage to Christ at his birth, magician and sorcerer. Okay. And we'll read one more little chapter. This one's called Bram Goldright. 20 feet of thick oak planking burst from its fastenings directly under Captain Kidd's feet. Thrown against the Titanic plate behind him, he careened through the deck, sliding down its face with great violence. Luck spared his life as the object tipped and came to rest in the opposite direction. Lying in a heap, Kidd landed on the first gun deck, unbalanced and taking on water. The ship listed hard on the port beam. Gunners, caught off guard, ignited their cannons prematurely, and several cannons detonated inside of the ship itself. Only their initial inclinations and heavy fastenings prevented a catastrophe as their shot exited their gun ports. Battered and bruised, Kidd rose to his feet, amazed that none of his bones seemed broken. Screams of struggling sailors and the sounds of rushing water came to his ears through the stairwell descending to the lower decks. The ship was in desperate shape, but she was not out of the fight yet. "You sailors," he said to recovering fighters around him, "go below and pull everyone back amidships. Batten the hatches to the forward compartments." "Aye, Captain," they replied, rushing to the stairs. "Get my damn guns back in line," he commanded. "Where the hell is my wizard?" he shouted to no one in particular. Shifting suddenly, the plate slid hard to port and actually helped to right the ship. Working his way around the wreckage, he reached the stairs and ascended onto the main deck. His sails were gone, and the masts still smoldered. Either everyone on deck was involved in the fight or fighting fires. They were sinking, slowly, but they would eventually go down. To his amazement, the block of iron vanished, and his profusely sweating mage appeared. "By all the gods of the sea, Goldright, you're a little late." "They don't have just one wizard on board," Bram reported. "They have two. I have brought down some of the spells protecting their ship, but they are sure to have more. You need to act fast." "Do what you can to get us back in range." "I have just the spell for that, Captain," Bram affirmed. And soon the men at the oars were rowing at double time. Lurching laboriously forward, seawater fully engulfed the ship's lower compartments. The waterline rose, sinking the oarsmen ankle deep and advancing. Captain Kidd shouted down from the breach in the main deck, "The first sailor to leave their bench before my command will be keel-hauled. Gunners, fire as soon as you have them in your sights." And keel-hauled was to haul a sailor under a vessel's bottom by ropes at the yard arms on each side. Formerly practiced as punishment in ships of war. Of course, the ship would be covered in barnacles, and it would be a very scratchy affair. Okay, so we'll begin next episode 46, back with Lord Guy the Archmagus in the chapter entitled The Archer's Tower. Thank you, and I hope you enjoyed it. Have a great night.